All right, hello everybody. Last time, what did we read? I believe, or I know, we read about the legitimate definition of the principle of definition itself. So when are definitions considered legitimate? And one point that stood out to me was that often points of conflict are excluded, um, and uh, the example of the student union research came up, and they it, they ignored the criterion of social origin. So this is a good example of a group imposing its own definition by the simple omission of a criterion that might introduce divisions that the group refused to admit. All right, then we read about operations of research as acts of constitution. So, um, what was read was that what I want to argue today is that a truly objective theory of classification must build into its theory the fact that objective classification is itself a matter for debate. So, uh, this implies that we have to integrate the fact that the classification we're doing itself is a object of contention. Um, then um, also this brings with it the fact that even though researchers may be not aware of it, they have an objective aim, and this objective aim always involves a worldview, and uh, as such is thus a political act. And so Bourdieu comes to the conclusion that the rigorous science that I hope to formulate has no chance of social success. I think this also implies that um, to be truly sociological rigorous, um, um, the sociological rigor always goes against, is itself always a point of contention within the social. So your research has to um, can never be like socially successful, or probably won't be accepted by society or its conclusions or its methods. Um, then classification as an object of conflict. We must acknowledge that classification is a bone of contention in science, and that it is also socially controversial to make scientists accept the fact that all classification is an object of conflict, both in science and society. So, a complete science of classification must include this conflict over classification. So, he's trying to think of a way to integrate this tension that exists when classifying into the research itself. Then, objectifying objectivism, or what is objectivism, or what is objectively objectivism. Um, and here came up the difference between objective classification and practical classification, the truth of both classifications, and that the practical truth doesn't see itself as a viewpoint. It maybe just sees itself as common sense, for example. But that having been said, reminding ourselves that classifications are a site of conflict allows us to turn around and look at the classifier through the eyes of practice, just as the objectivist viewpoint allows us to see practical struggles as monocritical and unilateral. So, reflecting on the existence in practice of a conflict over different types of classifications allows us to discover an objective truth behind objectivism, and in so doing, to raise the question of the social conditions that make this objective viewpoint possible. So I really like this how he takes these two different types of classification, like the practical and objective, and um, he's like saying yes, yes, but the objective classification itself also has practical implications. So we can flip this around and look at the objective classifications in practice, so we can get behind the truth of these objective classifications. Then, good classification and scholastic bias. So, a good classification will allow us to construct the generative matrix from which we may predict behavior and attitudes. So, a good classification always has the ability to predict behavior and attitudes in the future. And it also is important that we have to find the most powerful and efficient instrument to gain insight into the social world. And also, the questioning of classification itself also always has a function. So it's not just because, I don't know, we enjoy, well, maybe enjoyment is also a function, but not just for the sake of it. There's always something behind the questioning of classification itself that has a function, or it functions in a certain way. So whether sociologist or economist introduces an even more important bias because of the fact that he is unaware of the implications of his scholarship, ignorant of the fact that he has his own theoretical agenda. Also, this things comes back to the point made earlier about the example of the student union trying to research itself and um, maybe unconsciously ignoring certain important facts or important classifications that point to divisions. Um, and like the difference between who does the classifying again. And that this has an imposition effect. That this effect of who is doing the classifying also has an effect on the research itself. So the experimental status of the inquiry situation tends to generate works of fiction, artifact. Also, this was an important thing because also the research we're doing with Sarutu, um, the one question where we ask people uh, on which medium they spend the most time, I was like, what are we trying to get at? Because if we just aggregate all these um, outcomes or these results, are we not just measuring like market share or something? And what does this say? Um, it would be fun though to compare. Like maybe there obviously has been research about the market share of different companies, and does this correlate to the results that we gathered? Like for example, the questionnaire I sent out, like almost a quarter of the people spent their time on YouTube. So out of all the like internet media, does this 25% come up again in other research? Like, is the market share of YouTube 25% in the Netherlands, for example? Um, yeah. Then theoretical classification and practical classification. Um, Practical classification, the sort that you would use in a railway carriage to weigh up the situation and judge whether you can start a conversation or not, whether you can discuss politics and so on, functions at the subconscious, even a subverbal level. So again, we are always already classifying in this practical way, um, and it uses different schemas based on simple oppositions that may not even be conscious, but kind of just intuitive. So, when we ask people, for example, to classify themselves, um, we have to take this into account and also quote, one of our strategies in everyday life consists in manipulating classifications. In situations where we need to limit conflict as far as possible, we will seek out in the universe of properties of the alter ego facing us the properties closest to our own. We adjust the classifications so that we can recreate the same person as someone that we met on national service or danced with at a party, for instance. So I think this implies that in the practicality of our own classifying in social life, we try to classify so that conflict is avoided, and so that we can like interact with people um, interchangeably, like as if every different person is actually like the same human or something. And the scholar does not proceed in this way. He takes the whole set of criteria and proceeds to examine the links between them and assesses their relative importance. Um, so also the scholar is trying to rank um, and trying to link um, the different criteria and tries to also see the difference. Um, and this is something that just doesn't happen, or maybe does happen a bit, but not with the same aim. In practical life, the aim is to like avoid conflict for the most part, and the scholar does not take this into account in its own classification. This is like the last part with the example of the guy uh, being asked to like classify a whole bunch of different jobs, uh, and he makes like 5 piles. And just before he leaves, like the researcher asks him, uh, like, what job would you really not want to have? And he's like, a coal miner, a traveling salesman, or a TV presenter. And then he's asked why. And then he says, because I don't have the gift of the gab. And they are jobs for people who have particular habits. Most of them are queers. So this implies that by asking this question in this research setting, suddenly like a practical way of classifying comes up, um, that we would have not seen, that would not have come out if this question wasn't asked. Um, and so we wouldn't have known that there are people like who classify things based on like maybe their idea of like sexuality or yeah, or gender or something. So let's dive in. But first, let me get a sip of coffee. The next lecture of May, of lecture of the 26th of May 1982. Moving beyond the alternatives, reality and representation of reality, the autonomy of the social and the problem of self-awareness, the law, a special case of theory effect, words as common sense. I have suggested that a strictly rigorous science of social classifications should endeavor to integrate a rigorous theory of objective classification as well as a theory of the practical classification that social agents use in their everyday activities. It should go beyond the limits of those over-familiar alternatives in sociological thinking: physicalism or semiology, objectivity or subjectivity, realism or nominalism. For instance, it would be easy to show that the principal theories of social class are divided between these alternatives. One camp claiming to find their classes rooted in the real world, the other reducing them to subjective or at least nominal structures produced by the researcher. So, moving beyond these alternatives. In concrete terms, moving beyond these alternatives would require us to integrate objective classification with the conflict over classification, instead of simply juxtaposing the two. In the case of social class, we cannot avoid the encounter with Marx, and we cannot help thinking that he himself achieved this merger, because it was he who gave us both an objectivist notion of social class and a theory of the class struggle. Yet it seems to me that this integration is superficial, and I fear the weakness of Marx's thought lies in the fact that he did not integrate a scientific theory aiming to describe the social classes according to their objective properties with the theory of the struggle between different classificatory systems that might transform or modify this objective structure. It seems to me that he failed to achieve this integration, and that he allowed Marxist theory to oscillate successively or simultaneously between, on the one hand, a physicalist, mechanistic, and determinist kind of theory, which, for example, the theory of final catastrophe, which was much discussed in the interwar period, and on the other hand, a theory of revolution as a kind of engine where compression leads to explosion. The theory of self-awareness or class consciousness does aim to reconcile the physicalism with the spontaneity of the will, but in my opinion it does not succeed very well. Since the problem of the integration of the two poles of the alternative was neither stated nor resolved, the Marxist position, it seems to me, was led to internalize a kind of dualism, which we find at both the level of theory and that of practice. I would like to get to the heart of this failure to integrate. We are confronted with a sort of social physics, which describes social relationships and social classes as quasi-mechanical power relationships that are objective and independent of individual will and consciousness, according to Marx, and which may be measured by criteria analogous to those employed in physics and the natural sciences in general. Social classes become social groupings based on their almost automatically defined position in relations of production, which are a sort of defiant, intractable, and recalcitrant reality that nobody can modify, and that a rigorous science must duly study and bring to light. Then, a strictly scientific study of these objective power relations would enable us to elaborate a theory providing an understanding of objectively grounded groups, knowledge that would be both theoretical and practical, and thus able to act as a guide for political action. This distinctly physicalist, objectivist, and realist tendency, we might give each a tendency a separate title, is opposed to a more or less spontaneous tendency that would prefer to define social classes in terms of will. I am thinking, for example, of E.P. Thompson, a Marxist historian, loosely speaking, who describes class as an event, a happening, an eruption, or obviously of Sartre's reading of Marx. According to this spontaneous tendency, class is no longer a kind of reality inscribed in the very structure of the social world, but a sort of collective will, more or less produced by the sum of individual wills. Since these theories are often quasi-mythological, I cannot really formulate them clearly. I can only suggest that you refer to the kind of justifications we find offered by the fused class or the inspired class. there is a sort of Bergsonian Marxism. As I do not appreciate as I do not appreciate the arguments, I cannot discuss them objectively. But I think that the Marxist tradition is bound to oscillate between these two poles. This oscillation exists within the minds of people who think themselves as Marxists. And we might write a social history of Marxist thought that would reveal its pendular swing from one pole to the other. What I'm saying here is far too brief and caricatural, but my aim is less to describe these two ways of envisioning the social world than to try to discover why Marx was led into this kind of double bind, which I believe he thought he had found a way out of. In this field, as in many others, Marx broke with the common representation of the world, but was unable, perhaps because no one person could do both things at once, to integrate into his theory of the social world the recalcitrant forms from which he had to wrest his theory. We might be able to see this in the case of the Marxist theory of labor. The scientific endeavor requires a refusal to accept the data presented by the given world, along with their phenomenal appearances, such as the idea of work as a vocation, which Marx often discusses. The scientist aims to destroy and deconstruct common representations in order to construct an objective truth in opposition to them, and reconstruct labor as a producer of surplus value, or to construct objective classifications as a multi-criterial rather than monocriterial, as I did for my own construction of the economics of taste. But it is understandable that the person who managed to break away from these surface appearances found it difficult to reintroduce into his construction the recalcitrant given forms that he had to reject in order to construct it. Having broken with the version of reality imposed by ideology, in this particular case the intuitive theory of classification, the person making the break forgets to integrate into his model the forms that he had to reject in order to make this break, and whose social power is apparent in the very effort needed to make the break. If the objectivist break constantly needs to be repeated, it is precisely because it constantly conflicts with all our normal social experience. So yeah, this is like the tension uh, in doing sociology. Like you want to break with like common conceptions, but again, you cannot totally negate these common conceptions. Otherwise, you constantly run into the problem of being accused of just serving your own subjective bias and maybe throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. My own work has, in fact, one on more than one occasion consisted in trying to achieve a break and then to go beyond this break by reintegrating the lived or practical experience which it had to overcome. In case of labor, if we reduce the whole truth of labor, that is both its objective and subjective aspect to its objective truth according to the Marxist tradition, that is to a producer of surplus value, we forget that failure to recognize the objective truth of labor as producer of surplus value is part of the objective truth of labor. If Marx had discovered the whole truth about labor, everyone would be a Marxist, and there would be no need for political analysis or argument. This is why the opposition between objectivism and spontaneism that that I set out to describe is most often an opposition between the scholarly and the militant. For there is also a there is also a division of labor in the tradition of the labor movement. The theorists and the militants often have different social roots and different cultural experience. The theorists are commonly of a scientific, objectivist, determinist, and mechanistic persuasion, whereas the militants, actually involved in work, tend to follow a spontane, spontaneist, often follow their spontaneity voluntarist and activist path, one that favors a class in the making rather than a class to be found already composed in reality. I think that this distinctly fatal alternative is based on a logical error. We can understand why the person who did the most to destroy lyrical visions of labor or the social world was particularly vulnerable to this error, since the effort of breaking away does not incline you to understand and reintegrate what you have had to destroy. Reality and representations of reality. The basic idea that I have in mind is this: the way that social subjects represent the social world is part of the objective truth of the social world. Right, let me check if I'm still recording. Yes. Right. The social world is not simply the objective reality that the scholar constructs through statistical work and the accumulation of different criteria. For although the social agents engaged in objective practices of action suffer a sort of blindness, they are condemned to individual partial views and do not know the objective truth of the social world. This fact is itself a part of the objective truth of the social world. The scholar who forgets that not every social subject experiences the social world as he describes it in his research is guilty of ethnocentrism. And one of the most difficult aspects of scientific work is managing to integrate into the scientific account the primary experience that scientific study leads us to forget. For instance, although it is so tedious and awkward that we don't want to take on this additional burden, we ought to make the effort to constantly record our manner of representing the object that we are studying. In fact, the researcher himself is constantly remodeling his representation of the object, which means that he finds it very difficult to rediscover the initial experience that he had of his object. And when he delivers his final representations and conclusions, he is likely to make this mistake of perspective. Thus, for instance, once a scholar has characterized the realm of thought as a field and decides to describe the intellectual field or the university field as a space in which agents face specific challenges and deploy specific strategies to pursue their interest, there is no text. From a biography of Monet to an interview with Sartre or a debate between Brunswick and Nizan, that will not reveal an objective strategy. Every document, every letter, every style of writing starts to speak with the logic of the strategy. There are even ways of reading a document that objectify it. For example, I could read out aloud the famous text that Sartre wrote on the death of Merleau-Ponty, and simply by emphasizing here and editing there, make you feel what strategies of recuperation lie behind the humble and respectful homily. As soon as you have captured this objective vision, you find it difficult to reproduce your original naive reading. Luckily, certain philosophical texts have remained in my mind just as I found them when I first read them at the age of 20 or so. I can relive the naive experience that I had when I read Heidegger's Das Mann and managed to experience the overlap of the two experiences, one naive and one, shall we say, disenchanted. But from the moment when you have seen in Das Mann, they or the people, the they, the opposition between the crowd and the distinguished individual, the text takes on the guise of a gestalt figure. Once you have grasped its structure, you can see nothing else, and a fortiori, you find it almost impossible to communicate it. I often dream of a language of exposition which, like a musical language, would deliver at once the naive experience, what the faithful read in a Heidegger text, and what you can read between the lines. It ought to be possible to express both at once. But the difficulty also lies in the fact that the cost of discovering what you should read between the lines and the reward of feeling an ironic disenchantment are are so considerable that the scholar hardly wants to forego these benefits. it is much more agreeable to adopt a supercilious tone and make mock of the object. However, this leads to considerable errors of perspective, if only because the social world would not function at all if it resembled the researcher's objectivist description. Even if it is a reductive example, we can take the case of Sartre. If Sartre's eulogy to Merleau-Ponty had really been cynical and calculating, the eulogy would not have functioned as a eulogy, either in his eyes or those of his readers. There had to be a touch of innocence and naivety, even in his strategy of posthumous recuperation and settling of accounts. This is true on every occasion that society follows the path of belief, which is very often and even almost always the case. For objectification, by simply presenting as an ensemble things that are not usually recognized as a cohesive whole, does bring to light a hidden aspect of things. But it also destroys something constitutive of objectivity itself, which is the fact that things do not actually happen like that. And even if they did happen like that, society would not function at all. Hmm. Yeah, I'm really curious where this goes. Um, I don't know if these are the right words, but it almost seems like he's trying to maybe to put like the subjective experience back into the objective research. Um, I don't know how close this comes to Hegel. Like, is substance is subject? I don't know. Would be really interesting to do like a comparative comparative reading between like Zizek and these lectures or something. Although they have very different aims, I feel like this problem of trying to objectively describe reality always excludes the subject in a way. And how can we bring back this subject, and what is this subject or something? I'm not really sure, but I see his point that of course, or the social functioning itself always doesn't directly correlate with like the objective description of the social reality itself. And if it really overlaps fully 100%, then are we still talking about society? Or is society gone then? And do we just have like a, are we just like one big machine hive mind blob thing? Very interesting. Also, I don't know. I have to reread Baudrillard and In the Shadow of the Silent Majority. Hmm. All right. To return to the problem that I'm analyzing, which is a special case of the wider issue of objectivist relation to the object and the nature of ordinary experience in the social world, It seems to me that the objectivist theory of classifications and the objectivist vision of the social world as it is ignore the fact that it is not entirely objective. For example, if I constructed a space of teachers of French in higher education, which I could draw on the board as a diagram with measurable distances, we can be sure that the work involved in bringing this reality to light would change the nature of our thinking. I even think that to survive and above all to succeed in that space, you need a practical mastery of the structure that I can draw on the board. Although the structure depicted does not exist in anyone's conscious mind, and it is certainly not explicitly controlled by any of the agents. The difference between belief and cynicism is a very important social fact, and it depends precisely on the fact that we know not what we do, and that we can make people believe we are doing something other than what we are actually doing. For they know not what they do, right? If social agents were constantly obliged to attain conscious mastery of their practice, even supposing that they were not paralyzed by the excess of information and depressed by the sense of doom that it inspired in them, their existence of the social world would not correspond to what the social world, and in particular its cultural inverses, require. Its cultural universes require. That is, belief, innocence, naivety, and so on. If artists were conscious of what they were doing when they do what they do, they would not be able to do it at all. These are things that people like intellectuals and artists, who claim to be individually unique and distinguished, very often oppose to sociology. For years, I saw this as an ideological posture, a sort of defense of the human individual, a, a spiritual point d'honneur. But the fact that this discourse is ideological and defensive, that it is linked to what Marx called the spiritual point d'honneur of intellectuals and artists, does not mean that it does not contain its share of the truth. I think that, like any effective ideology, it has a foundation in reality, and that the objectivist approach really mutilates reality. Ordinary experience does not include a complete knowledge of itself and the space in which it operates. To summarize all this in a single sentence, I would say that the partial, functious, and mystified representation that agents make of the social world is part of the objective reality of the social world, which immediately implies that the theories, I shall return to this word, which provide representations of the social world, whether religious, scientific, or political, are themselves part of the social world. Yeah, yeah. We are always already in ideology. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, it's almost not yet, but almost as if he indeed is like saying the same as Zizek, that to see reality for what it is, we always already have to come from some sort of ideological position. Without this position, reality itself would disintegrate. It would be just the real, like the traumatic, unsymbolizable, we can say nothing about it, real. How does Bourdieu see this? The paradox is that the theory of the social world, which above all others has had the most powerful theory effect, did not include a theory of that effect. If there is a theory that has become reality, revealed the world to us, and made us believe its explanation of the world, it is certainly Marxist theory. Yet, this theory, especially at its scientific and mechanistic extreme, leaves no place for the fact that reality is constituted by representation. This is what I would like to reintegrate into a more inclusive analysis. The autonomy of the social and the problem of self awareness. I'm somewhat embarrassed by the direction my argument has taken. It is not that I am embarrassed to disagree with Marx, but I worry about disagreeing with Marx in the presence of people who might wonder what is implied by this disagreement. It is such a sacred realm, and I do not wish to commit sacrilege. But what I am saying is serious and absolutely relevant to the problem I am discussing. I believe that a true science of classification should integrate and define itself as the science of the relationship between practical classification and the objective classification constructed by the scholar through the accumulation of diverse criteria. The objective classification that allows us, for instance, to place social agents and their properties in a three or four dimensional space is more real in the sense that it's more predictive of reality than a practical classification in this sense. It is more natural classification, as a zoologist would say. This is what we often say when we credit a thinker with the capacity to reveal differences that we did not see before, that we sensed but did not know how to express. The academic classification, which reveals structures and relationships that go beyond partial appearances and perception, is closer to reality. But at the same time, it is quite unreal in the sense that it is not socially manageable. It is not practical in real life. You cannot use it to act because it is too complex. It is not functional. There's nothing we can do with it. It is born of a disinterested relationship with the social world. If we make the effort to integrate the two, we shall have to reject subjectivism and admit that the objective classification, the one that the scholar constructs with multiple criteria, is the basis for practical classifications. The practical classification of the social agents will match their objective position in the objective classification. The objective classification is the basis of the practical classifications. It defines internalized, incorporated divisions in terms of permanent dispositions and classificatory schemas. It defines the objective boundaries, that is, the material conditions of existence within which the practical strategies of classifications will operate. The objective or latent classification determines the form that the conflict over classifications will take. I could take the example of regionalism, where the classificatory stances ad- adopted reflect the classifier's own positions in the classifications, according to their propensity to use a particular type of classification when incorporated or objectified. The forms and uses of classification depend on the criteria used by the classifier. The prime example is that of taste, that incorporated system of classification which serves to classify, but which classifies the classifier. We should then replace subjectivism with a model where practical classification is subordinate to objective classification and objectivism. This is more or less what I was saying about Marx, who I had reduced to his objectivist aspect. The standpoint adopted is relatively independent of the position held. The relation is not automatic. A position in the objective social space does not correspond automatically to a particular political, religious, or aesthetic stance. The social space that we might characterize as political enjoys a relative autonomy from objective classifications. Is this autonomy the autonomy is this autonomy the autonomy of awakening consciousness? This, I think, is the key issue, even if I shall not insist on it today. The awakening of consciousness is one of the means which may help agents move away from their social position. But I think that it has taken an entirely disproportionate place in the Marxist tradition. It seems to me that in everyday life, the relations between people's positions and the stances they adopt are negotiated, not through acts of consciousness, but through what I call the habitus. That is the unconscious dispositions that are the result of incorporating structures and positional properties and lead to practices reformulating their position in terms of their own particular logic, without becoming explicitly conscious. You might raise the objection that others often put to me, which is that if the only possible relationship between positions held and stances adopted is fashioned by the mechanisms of the habitus, which is in its turn largely the product of positions held, no autonomy is possible. Yet, what I would like to show is that autonomy is possible, if not in the area of consciousness. The objective classifications define the conditions within which all these classes, whether present as name, representation, or will, can operate and have a chance of coming to fruition. But it remains the case that certain procedures, which we might call theoretical in the widest sense, I shall return to this, endowed with their own logic, produce representations that are independent of the positions held. What is the nature of this symbolic autonomy? Where do we locate the source of this disparity between what people actually are socially and their representations of the social world? The objective positions define the limits within which the representations may vary, but within those limits there is room for maneuver, which I would like to emphasize is precisely what characterizes symbolic power. In fact, symbolic power is the power to exploit this leeway between positions and dispositions, and we can find the same dispositions translated by different stances. I would like to take a very simple example. I do not believe that a certain position in production relations, to use strictly objectivist language, defining the proletarian in rigorously theoretical terms, must automatically elicit the alternatives of remaining unconscious or consciously awakening to a dazzling revelation of the objective truth of the worker's condition. It relates rather to dispositions that are the incorporated product of a certain experience of the social world, defined precisely in terms of holding a certain position in production relations, and which, whether rightly or wrongly, I leave you to judge, can be reflected in very different explicit representations of the social world. In other words, dispositions enjoy a certain fluidity in their relationship to discourse, and the passage from a practical disposition to a discourse claiming to express it is a qualitative leap of such radical discontinuity that, in fact, diverse explanatory discourses can account for the same disposition. Or inversely, some dispositions can be plausibly located in quite different explanatory discourses, although each claims to represent the sole truth of the practice. I have often described these phenomena of allodoxia, and I think the move into politics occurs when we leave the doxa. That is, the sort of purely dispositional experience of the pre-explicit, pre-thetic, subconscious, and sublingual world that guides the majority of our everyday actions, and move to an orthodox or heterodox experience. The orthodox experience being the belief in a just and righteous belief in a dominant faith. It is in this passage from the doxa to an orthodoxy or a heterodoxy that there is room for maneuver. Ultimately, if each and every disposition implied be ultimately, if each and every disposition implied the disposition to produce its own legitimate explanation, there would be no place for politics, no place for all those who manipulate and exploit this discrepancy. That is, not only the politicians, but all professional commentators. These professional commentators make a living from the discrepancy and their lives dependent on the possibility of allodoxia, in the fact that people can think different things. Let me go into more detail. Insofar as science discovers that there are both objectively well grounded classifications and also classifying acts that, despite being closely linked to objective positions in the classifications, are relatively autonomous in relation to these positions. Sociologists are faced with an alternative. They can take as their aim either to champion their own objective classification against all the other systems of classification competing for the legitimate representation of the social world. This is the temptation of objectivism, which always claims that its classifications are superior to those of rivals, or declare that reality is constituted by the most powerful competing classifications, which means that it is ultimately the dominant ideology that constitutes reality. The dominant representation of the social world is part of reality, and in this light, the law would become the social science par excellence. As I said in passing one day, from its very beginning, the science has had to affirm itself and constitute itself against the law. If Marx, Durkheim, and Weber all see the confrontation with the law as capital, it is because the juridical discourse on the social world has a form of validity. To a certain extent, when conservative sociologists believe they can describe the world as it is, or as the dominant representation says that it is almost legally bound to be. They have some justification. They are so difficult to attack because, in a way, they have social reality on their side. Most often, the people who are content to repeat the dominant account of reality have social reality on their side, and in this way have every likelihood of finding their representation confirmed. Ah, this is also go back to like the his claim that the sociology or the theory of sociology or the sociological research he is trying to construct is bound to be not accepted. Hmm. And also, how do we not find ourselves trapped in like this common sense of if the social reality is against my theorization, then it must be right. Like Zizek is often like this, like when both the left and the right get bad, it must be because I'm onto something. Which I think there's of course a lot of truth in this. But again, how can this can also like um, function in like almost a dogmatic way. Yeah, hopefully he goes into this. One possible mission of sociology then might be to register the most powerful classifications, that is, the most predictive and established. One possible mission of sociology then might be to register the most powerful classifications, that is, the most predictive, and establish certain nomenclatures. The word nomenclature is an important word in some societies, which are reality, which become reality itself. We can well conceive of a scientific juridical theory, sufficiently founded scientifically to be validated in general terms and at the same time founded in law, that is able to provide its own verification because it would bring into existence what it what it declares to exist. This would be the supreme challenge for the social sciences. In fact, the societies that experience this situation hardly have any social science at all. So I think that social science is an absolute challenge. We have to choose between social order and social science. Ho ho! All right. The argument that I am developing here is particularly difficult. I am reaching the limits of what I can think. It raises the question of what precisely we mean by scientific thought. It seems to me that the first conclusion to be drawn from the reflections that I have pursued so far as follows. The conflict over classification is part of the objective truth of classification, although it enjoys a relative autonomy from classifications themselves. In the second part of my argument, I now hope to determine what constitutes the specific logic of the conflict over classification, to say what forms the basis of its autonomy and therefore the source of its symbolic power, seen as a power relatively autonomous from other forms of power like economic power or the power of purely physical violence. What is at stake in the battle over classification is the production and imposition of the legitimate mode of representation of the social world, able to impose its authority and thereby to guarantee its own verification. As I said just now, when speaking of the law, a legal discourse may ultimately become a performative discourse. It may be false from a scientific point of view, but may still have the ability to verify itself. If I am powerful enough and I say, tomorrow the entire French working class will rise up and demand a 35-hour working week, I can make this proposition come true, even if, from the point of view of a rigorous scientific account of social structures and power relationships, my declaration might appear to be fraudulent. Does this mean that such a power to mobilize reality has no limit? In fact, how far it can operate beyond objective limits is prescribed by objective reality. For it to succeed, however, there must be an objective basis, although this does not mean that everything has to be present in the objective conditions. The struggle over classification is a struggle for what I call the constitutive power, that is, the essentially political power to bring into being what is declared to exist. It is a struggle for the imposition of an accredited and universally recognized classification. The success of this certified classification will not depend merely on the fact that politicians, for example, will agree to acknowledge it, or scientists to say that it is official, but also on its ability to constitute reality. It will take on the force of law, insofar as people will really be classified according to the system, with all the consequences resulting. They will or will not have identity papers. They will be well considered or looked down on, properly or badly paid, etc. The struggle for accredited classification is therefore more than an ideological struggle, in the usual sense of a struggle which would take effect only in the realm of ideas or representations. The struggle to impose a dominant representation is at one and the same time a struggle to make that dominant representation become real, operate in the real world, and constitute reality. For this, it must be convincingly compatible with reality, which does not mean that it has to be inscribed in reality in advance. The law, a special case of a theory effect. I will try to illustrate the nature of this struggle with a simple example concerning the problem of law. We live within the law without thinking about it, and the power to say what is just and right, i.e., the right as opposed to the left, the straight versus the crooked, the masculine in relation to the feminine, the dominant and the legitimate rather than the dominated and the illegitimate, the religious and the official instead of the magical, the unofficial and the hidden, and so on, depends on being able to wield precisely the symbolic power that is able to impose a common set of points of view. It is the power to impose a consensual view of the meaning of the world, to impose universal principles that direct this vision and the actions and representations that it entails. Finally, this power is what I would call, in the broadest sense, the power to exercise a theory effect. Taking the word theory in its etymological sense, theory is a commonplace concept in the epistemological tradition. It is what makes us see things that we would not otherwise have seen. The epistemological tradition has provided many examples of the theory effect. When a theory is constituted, phenomena that were not previously perceived and realities that were confused become distinct. In other words, we see only what we devised the theory to look for. The law is a special case of the theory effect, just as political action is. For through the exercise of legitimate nomination, someone who holds symbolic authority can force social subjects to abandon their doubts about the meaning of the world. To understand the power of the theory effect, we need to realize that it is not at all easy to acquire a clear vision of the world, and especially of the social world. What has often been said of the natural world, namely that it is ambiguous and indeterminate, and that social subjects can only discover an order to it by applying structuring systems, is almost a fortiori true for the social world itself. Max Weber spoke of Vielseitigkeit, many-sidedness, that is to say, the multiple facets of the social world, where social realities are only ever revealed as outlines or fragments. These realities are never entirely grasped as a whole, which leaves the social subject more or less disarmed when facing the present conditions when facing the present condition of the social world, let alone its future. It is no coincidence that forecasting or prediction, are one of the central problems in political life, because one of the factors affecting the uncertainty of meaning of the present is precisely the future that is pregnant with. We cannot tell what is making it uncertain. This is a classic trope of the philosophy of history. The power of prediction of those who have a theory that will enable us to see the relevant connections is effective because the meaning of the social world is not given and finite, but open and provisional. Weber's theory of prophecy says just this: the prophecy effect, which is one of the archetypical forms of the theory, effect, consists in providing systematic answers to the urgent questions asked by social agents in their greatest need, ranging from the questions of life and death that all prophecies have to answer to the most banal questions of everyday life. Should we wear a hat or not? Should we place our hand on our heart when we salute the flag? The purpose of The purpose of prophetic discourse is to relieve believers completely of any anxiety about the meaning of the world. Words as common sense. What I would like to show is that even the most ordinary language that we use to express our world functions in this way. A saying or a proverb is a prophecy in miniature. Uh, an American philosopher, Kenneth Burke, has written an analysis of proverbs and slang, showing that they are not neutral formulae at all, but a kind of action plan that targets a specific person and at the same time indicates how to deal with them or what to do with them. They are not impartial commentaries at all. They are incitements to act in a certain way. The most ordinary sayings define an attitude that is approved and authorized by the whole group. Proverbs are common sense, and having common sense on your side gives and having common sense on our side gives us strength, because their every word is ethically loaded. If you are an ordinary individual engaged in the social world, it is very reassuring to have common sense on your side. You only have to think of slogans, which I shall return to later. Proverbs are always slogans. The pleasure and gratification that we derive from repeating sayings that have been pronounced 100 times in circumstances socially devised to elicit them. I could think of countless examples. It's due to the fact that we live our lives as if we had the backing of the whole social order, with its fashions, its morals, and its orthodox thinking and behavior. The cleavage dividing righteous and lawful thinking from the cleavage dividing righteous and lawful thinking from left-leaning thinking, seen as clumsy, shameful, clandestine, unofficial, and unwilling to speak its name out loud, clearly echoes the whole opposition between religion and magic analyzed in the sociological tradition. We can ascribe to the realm of magic all the things that we have never been able to express. One of the most powerful effects that the social world exerts, the effect of formalization, relies purely and simply on this magic. It doesn't actually change anything in reality. People who have lived together for 20 years go to the town hall and they come back married. We are often satisfied to say that this is just a social convention. But in fact, it concerns things that are not consciously analyzed. The fact of getting married in full public view, leaving the unofficial, the clandestine, the shameful, the unmentionable, and the hidden in order to pass over to the official is a radical change. Uh, we are often satisfied to say that this is just a social convention, but in fact, it concerns things that are not consciously analyzed. The fact of getting married in full public view, leaving the unofficial, the clandestine, the shameful, the unmentionable, and the hidden, in order to pass over to the official, is a radical change. And I think that one of the most powerful political effects is the publication effect. Öffentlichkeit, which is the act of making open. Öffentlichkeit, openness, which is the act of making open, patent, patent or public, the act of publishing or displaying. Wait, I'll read this again. Such a long sentence. The fact of getting married in full public is a radical change, and I think that one of the most powerful political effects is the publication effect. Okay. The people who follow the straight and narrow, who are in the right and on the right, are those who can expose themselves and what they are with no shame, since they have the whole social order completely on their side. I think that this logic of making public is a significant example. I think that this logic of making public is a significant example of the theory effect. When a theory becomes orthodox and dominant, it becomes a collective vision of the world, and this collective vision of the world becomes the world itself. It is only an artifice of the materialist tradition that has accustomed us to distinguish between the social world and our vision of the social world. A vision of the social world, when it is consensual, is the social world. It creates the social world. And with the whole social world to support me, there is no longer any discrepancy between what I think and what exists. The whole point of the struggle for symbolic domination is to impose this immersion in orthodoxy. In a way, the price fought for in all the struggles between intellectuals, administrators, and more generally between all those who have the power to define the social world with authority, is the right to impose a consensual vision of the world that can not only describe the world, but bring it into being. In Dictionary of Indo-European Concepts and Society, Benavist remarks that all the words which designate the law in Indo-European languages are related to the root to say, to speak, as if to speak was always to say what is right, to say what exists, and in what form. As soon as you are allowed to speak publicly without concealment, you are backed by a whole group that delegates to you the power to say with them and on their behalf what exists. And since you are supported by a whole group, you draw on the power that it has to constitute and impose reality. This is precisely the logic of the performative. It goes without saying that the goal of the struggle for symbolic power is to gain the authority that allows one to pronounce performative statements that carry positive sanction. The meeting is opened. In conclusion, I return to the conditions that make this performance effect possible. There are, of course, and I shall consider later, conditions that must be met by an individual agent in order to be able to speak on behalf of the group. That is the conditions for acquiring authority. But there are also conditions that concern the social world as object of this authority, properties which make the operation of the theory effect possible. I have already underlined the ambiguity. I have already underlined the ambiguity of the social world, and contrary to the realist theory that is often accepted consciously or unconsciously by sociologists, I think that our representation of the social world is not a reflection. It is neither a direct insight nor a mechanical reflection, but a construction that is nearly always collective and relies in particular on language. I think that if, like Benavist, we can use a purely linguistic analysis to derive a theory of the social world, it is because we use language to construct the social world. If there is an area where the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the hypothesis according to which language is constitutive of reality, and the Humboldt-Cassier tradition, which is independent of preceding one but is also neo-Kantian, language constructs reality and provides the structures that inform the social world, are true, it is the realm of the social world. The objective indeterminacy of social world allows us to apply to it the elementary instrument of thought, the word, the ordinary word. For example, I think that one of the most interesting objects of study in the field of the moral code of a class could be the use of interjections and exclamations. We can find a whole philosophy and representation of the world contained in this kind of exclamation, which is a bodily and verbal way of reacting to the world, and one that has been acquired in a completely unconscious way by associating with and imitating people faced with the same situations. It is through the use of ordinary language, proverbs, and set phrases that a group assimilates and acquires its moral code. Of course, the social conditions affecting the production and mode of operation of the diverse proverbs of political slogans are many and various. In one case, they may have a common, unanimous sense, given in the language. In another, they may depend on individual agents whom we can locate in a specific position in the social space. But in terms of the effect exerted on our perception of the social world, the logic is exactly the same. For example, although the social world is a place of continuity, the symbolic power of the classifiers consists in introducing discontinuity, imposing a right and a left, a masculine and a feminine, and so on. I'm thinking, for example, of the work of a statistician who has tried to show how statisticians in our societies are constantly dividing up continuums and classifying things that escape classification or are absolutely unclassifiable. When the people of INSEE, again, INSEE, really, I don't know, I got the feeling he doesn't really like INSEE. When the people of INSEE classify as a student who earns their living as a waiter in a restaurant, they introduce an arbitrary separation in a dual or even multiple reality. They introduce discontinuity into the continuum, as do the primitive classifications described by Levi Strauss, when they say there is hot and cold, wet and dry, sunshine and moonlight. This discontinuity strikes true immediately when it is backed by the social order, because it can be published, declared, and openly displayed and illustrated, which leads to the predictions formulated by this classification being confirmed. at least by the other members of the group. A worldview is a system of predictive schemas that, being shared by all, become true and validated. The system of prediction that you are using may seem crazy seen from the viewpoint of a different forecasting system, but within a universe where everyone else shares the same system, you are in the right. Thus, in a society where the dominant classificatory principle was religion, behavior which now seems incoherent to us was seen as coherent, and its coherence was constantly reinforced, since it found confirmation of its own validity in other people's behavior, orchestrated in accordance with the same structures. All right, this was May and April, almost halfway. I think I'm gonna leave it here. Think about it a bit, and next session, which will be, ooh, let me check. I think again Wednesday, the 9th at 2 p.m. Central European time, which I don't know. You have to figure it out what time it is for you. Always feel free to join or to leave comments or whatever. But yeah, next time I think I'll start again with the summary of the last lecture I read. I think this also forces me to go over it again a bit, and yeah, I don't know, works for me. Anyways, have a great day. Enjoy or not, I don't care. Bye.